Good afternoon. Before I get started, I want to tell you a short story about when I was in law school, we all have to take ethics in law school as a course. And what? Yeah, wow. All right. And with that, one of the most important things that the professor had taught us was you're not going to remember everything that you'll learn in the course. It's just impossible. There's so many rules, there's so many things, so many permutations and twists and turns. The most important thing to take out of an ethics course in law school is to know when to ask the question, to know that there's something that calls for caution and for follow-up before you act. I tell you that because that applies here as well. It's impossible in an hour to go over everything that may apply to you as members or your staff. There are a variety of sources. There's countless rules and statutes and twists and turns. A lot of them are going to be fact-specific. What I'm going to do here is hit the highlights, the things that I think would be of most use to you on a more frequent basis, and ideally and ultimately to at least leave you with the ability to ask the question. If you know you're in a situation where, I think I should follow up, I think I should check on this before I do anything further, that would be a success for me today. And I hope we accomplish that at the end of the hour. What I also hope to accomplish here is to prompt some questions. This should be in some way, to the extent it's possible in this venue, to have a conversation. I hope we can do so. So feel free, if you think of something you want to ask, by all means, please raise your hand. What I would caution you about is let's not get into fact specifics. If you have a specific factual scenario you want to go over, we are here. I am here. Happy to meet with you privately after this session or at any time in the future. Just give me a call, stop by. And it's probably better, more appropriate to sit down in that kind of format and go over things. But if you have general questions, things that if I say something that is unclear, and that's possible, by all means, please ask. All right, as I noted, there are a variety of sources, not all of which we can cover here today, but there's quite a bit that governs not just members, but public employees generally, and elected officers throughout the state. The big one, of course, is Article 2, Section 8 of the Florida Constitution. There's also Part 3, Chapter 112 of the Florida statutes. That is the ethics code for all public officers and employees. Of course, there's Chapter 11, Florida statutes, which applies specifically to the legislature. And we have our own rules in the House, plus the joint rules. I do this just to set the tone. As everyone knows, Article 2, Section 8 declares a public office is a public trust. That drives everything else that we talk about. That is the whole point of all the rules and limitations and prescriptions, is to ensure that the public office that you hold is maintained as a public trust. The Florida Code of Ethics goes a little bit further and puts a little bit more detail on this. I won't read it all to you, but the general idea is to ensure that you as public officials remain independent, remain impartial, and give assurance to the public that you're not using your office for private gain, and that you're not engaging in any sort of conflicts of interest or voting in favor of certain special interests or something as opposed to the general public interest. All right, so let's dive into it. I've divided it up just for ease of reference and a little bit of, to make it a little bit easier to get through. I divided it up into 4 categories of concerns. Conflicts of interest, gifts and lobbyist expenditures, voting conflicts, and then finally the full and public financial disclosure that each and every one of you is required to make every year. The first one is going to be conflicts of interest. I'm going to go over, and I will apologize in advance. It's going to sound like a lot of do nots, but that is the nature of the beast. And so we will go through them. And again, if you have any questions as I go through these, if you want a little bit more detail, we can stop and talk about it a little bit. All right. Conflicts of interest and the do nots. The big one, presumably the obvious one, is please don't solicit or accept anything of value based on an understanding that the vote that you might cast or the official action that you may be expected to take would be influenced. Now, that is an overarching principle. It doesn't matter who's giving you the thing of value. It could be a lobbyist, it could be a non-lobbyist, it could be a relative. It could be someone you don't know. It could be completely random. Someone comes across and says, here, take this. If you know or have reason to know that the intent is to influence your vote, do not accept that. That would be a violation. Next is self-dealing. Just generally speaking, what that means is that you're precluded from engaging in any contracts or purchasing directly, indirectly, renting directly, indirectly from or to engaging in that type of commercial relationship between the legislature or a legislative entity and yourself or a business interest that you have. There is an exception to this, and that is you as a member may have your district office in your place of business. So if you already have an office space and you want to use some of that office space as your district office, that is permissible. Or if you own the property where your district office might be, that also is permissible. Otherwise, there's no dealing. You can't have commercial dealings between yourself or your business interests on the one hand and the legislature or a legislative entity on the other. The next do not is do not accept anything of value when it should be known it was given to influence action. So it's not just accepting anything of value based on an understanding, but even if it's implicit, unspoken, but you have reason to believe or you should know that that was the intent, you still need to avoid it. All right, the next set of do nots. I told you there are going to be several. There's a bunch of these. And again, the idea is to raise questions, caution, put up yellow flags if you come across a situation that you have some concern about. So the next item is do not corruptly use or attempt to use your position to secure a special privilege, benefit, or exemption. And that's not just for yourself, that's for anyone. So the prescription is against using your office to get some special benefit and doing that in a corrupt way. And that is, in a corrupt way is wrongful intent plus it is. So corruptly is two components. You're taking the action with wrongful intent and to obtain a benefit resulting from the act or omission of yourself that is inconsistent with the proper performance of your public duty. So if you offer to do something that otherwise is not in the public interest, so you're doing it for some special consideration, and you're doing it with wrongful intent, you're doing it to gain an advantage for somebody or for yourself, that would be a problem. Please avoid that. The next item to not do is please do not hold employment or a contract with an entity or agency that is subject to regulation of or doing business with the legislature. Now, the first part is probably not going to apply to you because the legislature only, generally speaking, regulates entities, and that would be through the passing of laws. If it's only to pass the law, that's the only action the legislature is taking, that doesn't count as regulatory action. But if there's some specific regulation or some specific regulatory authority that the legislature has over this entity or agency, you cannot have employment with that entity or agency. It's more likely that the more likely application for you would be an entity that is say what I call a legislative vendor. So an entity that does business with the legislature, sells items, engages in contracts with the legislature. That's where you need to exercise caution and avoid the employment with an entity that does that. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Not off the top of my head, actually. So the principle comes out of Chapter 112, and so not everything is going to specifically apply to the legislature, but if it would be very rare, I suspect. But if it were to happen, it's just a consideration to have. If you have employment that in some way would be subject to some specific inquiry by the legislature. And that's why I said it's more likely on the vendor side if you have employment with a business entity that does business with the legislature. That's where you should especially be cautious. Yes, sir. That, hypothetically speaking? Yeah. Yeah. You're. If it is, well, that may end up being a more fact-based situation that you and I may want to talk about separately. And I don't mean to suggest that it's bad. I don't want to have that air left. That's the type of specifics where it may be best if because there may be some additional facts we would want to know and walk you through in terms of considerations before we give you a more definitive answer. Yeah. Sure. It is. I mean, that's a good question, and I know that's probably not unusual. So I encourage those kinds of questions. But please, let's sit down and talk about it some more.
I would love for you to sit down and talk to them, but I just want to hear one thing. Is it anything to do with, okay, if you do have a situation where you abstain from the vote or something, would that be appropriate for something like that? If he actually working in his own business, or I'm working in my own business, and, you know, I'm bidding, correct? And as long as me as the office holder sustain from the vote of whatever got to do with my business, wouldn't that suffice?
Well, now we're getting into voting conflicts, which we're going to cover shortly. And there's two separate things going on here. Right now with the conflicts of interest, it may be an artificial division. I mean, I just did it for the purposes of presentation. But right now when talking about conflicts of interest,
Yeah,
just talking. Sure. We're just talking. Right. Right. And so voting conflicts is on one side, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Business interests and employment, and we're talking, that's conflicts of interest, and that's what and those are the types of things that could be very fact specific. We've already gotten a number of questions about, well, I'm on this board, or I'm employed here. Can I keep that employment while I'm a member? And they do end up be getting additional questions to get some more facts, and they really can end up being specific pretty quickly. Once again, this is it's the Thanksgiving dinner. I have a friend, hypothetically speaking, just saying kind of thing. All right. You can tell it's the afternoon. It's the last session. That's great. It's all right. All right. Continue on with the list of do nots. The next one is no insider dealing. That means please don't use information you obtain through your official position that is not public information. So situations where the general public wouldn't have access to that information, you can't use that information that you get for your own benefit or the benefit of someone else to get some sort of financial gain. And that includes buying or selling investments or creating income for yourself or anyone else. It's almost like insider trading, but not exclusively insider trading. It could be a variety of other things as well. Please don't engage in nepotism. That means a member cannot advocate for or employ a relative in a position in the legislature. The exclusion of that would be pages and messages are okay. Or to volunteer, that's right. Continuing on. Oh, I'm sorry. And I went over the big one. There we go. Just going to slide that by, right? Oh, thank you. As everyone knows, a new rule in the House that everyone has adopted. There's no flying on private planes owned, leased, or procured. And procured means obtaining for you, not necessarily renting or owning themselves, but calling someone else to get the plane for you. That's procuring. If that's done by a lobbyist or a principal, regardless of whether you offer to pay the value of it, you can't do it under the rules. So don't fly on a private plane, period, if owned, leased, or procured by a lobbyist or a principal. Yes, ma'am. The spouse flying on the plane?
No, she owns the plane.
Or the spouse owns the plane? So your spouse would fly on the plane, but not you? Well, it would probably, just given the spirit of the other rules, and the rules and the statutes anticipate, and there's a link between members and spouses, so there are a lot of things that members can't do and spouses can't do, and that's under the law and the rules. I suspect that would be the same standard. It would be best if the spouse also did not fly on the plane.
What about an ex-wife?
Fact specific, please see me after and we can talk about it. I am here all afternoon for 4:18 in the Capitol. All right. Please. You broke my train. All right, please don't solicit or accept campaign contributions during session. That's any session, regular session, special session, an extension of session. And accepting, and remember, and I want to highlight, it's soliciting or accepting, so don't ask and don't take contributions during session. And I want to also highlight what that includes. That means not on behalf of yourself, not on behalf of the party or a party, and not on behalf of any political committee or a 501c4, so a community organization. And political committees, that means state and federal political committees. Anyone, any entity exempt under 527 of the Internal Revenue Code.
It does not include 501c3s, though, correct?
Notably, that's correct. That is specific to 501c4s and 527s. Yes, sir. there was a couple things going on in that question. So the first thing I'm hearing from you, though, and where you should have a concern, is who's paying for the dinner. So, I mean, that, which is going to get into something else I'm going to talk about in a moment. If you're attending a dinner and you're eating at it, presumably, there could be other concerns that you want to be addressing, including who's paying for it, and is that a gift or is it an expenditure by a lobbyist? That's on the one hand. And then, I'm sorry?
I may buy a table at the dinner and participate, but can I actually participate? Can I physically show up to this dinner? The sole purpose of the dinner is a fundraiser for a local party. And they've asked us to attend. And it seems like each year the answer is different. Well, you can go, but your name can't be listed on the invitation, or no, you can't go.
Right.
I'm just trying to find some clarification.
And I'm sorry for so everyone on this corner of the room, the question was, what about, would you say, like Lincoln Day dinners and fundraisers for political parties or other type things where you're invited to attend? You may even be on the official invitation or something like that. I was going to ask that question, and that's just something to be concerned about. I would suggest caution if you came to me privately, and we went through some of the facts. One of the things I would hit on is they're putting your name on the invitation. That sounds a lot like soliciting or looking for campaign contributions during session. If you're buying a table and the money is going to operate as making campaign contributions, presumably it's going to lead to encouraging others to make contributions. I would counsel caution in that respect. But I would also be asking about who's funding it, and I would have concerns about you attending that. There may be some other aspects of it that you may want to talk about with us. If you just attend a public function, that would be fine. You don't eat, you don't partake, or anything like that. I mean, just the ethics rules don't get into where you're showing up. But if you remember, there's no soliciting or accepting of campaign contributions, and ethics have. If you think of it as circles, concentric circles, and here's what you definitely can't do, and then you go out from there, and maybe it's not exactly prescribed, but you're putting yourself at risk of being in a situation where you might have a problem. And so the best thing to do in ethics with respect to ethics is to avoid situations where you might be in an awkward position, shall we say. Yes.
Excuse me, yeah, that put me in mind, like, my district, I have a lot of homeowner associations and other type of
Sure.
associations that we always go to. And they have cookies in there. They have food. What do I do?
I would ask, are they a lobbyist or a principal? That would be, are they a lobbyist? Yeah. Sure.
Associations that call you, bust you out, and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But if you're going to hear what the issue is.
Right. Well, the reason I wasn't being flip about it when I asked, are they a lobbyist or a principal? This should be, remember what I said at the beginning, I'm trying to give you some principles to abide by, and when you encounter situations, you should have a mental checklist. And one of the first questions, and I will get to it in a moment, one of the first questions should always be, are they a lobbyist or a principal? Because if they're a lobbyist or a principal, then the answer is going to be don't take anything from them. But if it's an HO, only, as I will note in a moment, only up to $100 in value. Otherwise, you have to report it. Yes, the question is, will I define principal? I will define it now, and then we'll touch on it a little bit more in a moment. A principal is essentially someone who hires a lobbyist. So if the entity or person pays for a lobbyist, they're a principal. the association hires a lobbyist?
They're not directly hiring lobbyists. The association hires lobbyists.
It's a good question. So the question is so let's take the HOA cookie scenario for a moment and pull it out a little bit more. This was not when I anticipated the questions that were going to be asked. But this is great. This is great. This is good stuff. The question was, if, let's say, the HOA itself is not a principal, the HOA does not hire a lobbyist, but the HOA belongs to some statewide association that in turn hires a lobbyist. The answer is no, that HOA is not a principal unless, and there's always unlesses with the ethics code, unless the lobbyist for that statewide association did some work specifically for that particular HOA. That would be a different scenario. That's unlikely. So the general question, if the HOA is part of a larger association that in turn hires a lobbyist, that individual HOA is not likely going to be a principal. And eat the cookies, yes. But only up to $100, otherwise you have to report it. Yes, sir.
Is there a distinction or difference between a principal contracting lobbyist or paying a salaried employee who happens to register as a lobbyist to be compliant with law?
So if let's say a corporation has a vice president of government affairs kind of thing, so they're on staff, and that government affairs person is one that does the lobbying, yes, they would still be a lobbyist. Still be a principal. Do I have that right, Michael? Is that about right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Now, the nonprofit status. Where I come from, most of the city is nonprofit, and that's why we follow the organization. And I be a part of the nonprofit, or I don't work, but I'm a board member of a nonprofit. It's community development from the county. They kind of have CAC, and I'm a member of it. And my job is to do economic development. I don't get no money. I work for free. Am I still allowed to work as a volunteer or as a volunteer nonprofit inside the area?
Now we're at a level of detail where that is. I'm sorry?
It's an open book.
Sure. No, but there were some questions I'd want to ask and would want to sit down and get into a little bit more detail with you before I gave you an answer, which this is not probably the best forum to do that for you. So,
It don't matter. I mean,
yeah.
it's an open book. That's what I'm saying.
I understand.
I
Yeah.
always do business above the shape.
Right.
That's why I can act clearly.
But come see me, even just right after we're done. I mean, let's just check in and bring some cookies. Not that it will influence my advice. All right, we're going to move on. This is in the rules now. The next thing not to do is accept new employment. Now you remember, please don't accept new employment with a public employer or with an entity receiving direct appropriations without filing a disclosure with the Public Integrity and Ethics Committee, either prior to the start of that employment or within 30 days after acceptance, whichever is earlier. Along the same lines, I just highlight a slightly different component. There's some aspects of dual public employment. So as a member, you get an opportunity to work for some agency. The general rule there is please don't accept that if you know that the reason that you're being hired is to obtain influence. There are factors to be considered, which I would encourage you, if this comes up, please come see us and we'll walk through them. If you're considering employment with a public agency now that you're a member. And then another do not is please don't solicit or accept employment or investment advice arising out of your legislative activities or your political activities. Another component of the House rules is please don't enter into investment, joint venture, or profit-making relationships with lobbyists or principals while you're a member. There's an exception, as there invariably are. There's an exception for, let's say you're a partner in a law firm and one of your partners is a lobbyist. That's not included in this rule. There's an exception for employment relationships and professional partnerships where you're providing professional services.
I got a question, real quick.
Yes.
So what happens if you own a company that's in negotiations to buy another company, but that company employs lobbyists?
That might be an issue with respect to this rule. So it's a good question. There may be more to that, but that would be a point of concern before I went forward. If I were in the hypothetical situation shoes, the hypothetical member's shoes, I'd want to explore that a little bit further before closing on the deal. All right. Some more do nots. Please do not lobby for compensation any local government or local government agency. This is a new component of the rules that you all just added. That means don't act as a paid lobbyist in front of any local government or local government agency. Lobbying is a common term of don't advocate for, it's advocating for action or inaction in front of a county commission, a local board or government entity of the commission or the city council. The exception for this is if as a lawyer or an engineer, some sort of licensed professional services that you're providing have you going in front of local government or a local agency on behalf of your client. That's excluded from this proscription. And this is an area where if you have fact-specific concerns, that please come see us. We've already answered several questions with respect to this, and we're happy to work with you and get you some guidance. Oh, I'm sorry.
A lot of the lobbying rules in local governments vary, but a lot of times it's a threshold. It's if you spend a majority of your employment time meeting with local elected officials, then you have to register as a lobbyist.
Right.
If you don't meet that threshold to register as a lobbyist, but as part of your job, you may have to periodically meet with local elected officials. Does that invoke this rule?
Any sort of local thresholds or local registration requirements don't govern what is meant by this rule. So if it is advocating for action or inaction from a local government agency or the county commission, municipal council, regardless of the thresholds or how much time you're spending, if it's paid lobby work in that respect, it's going to be covered by this rule, unless the services that you're providing are licensed professional services that incidentally have you interacting with that local government or agency.
Yes, that's for constituent, for without getting paid, lobbying, can you get situation?
If it's for a constituent and it's not paid, then no, that's not what's covered by this rule. Yeah. But I would be careful not to remember one of the earlier principles: don't misuse your position to gain influence or some special benefit for a constituent or anyone else. But just going in front of a going to a local government or local agency on behalf of a constituent to just talk with someone, no, that's not what's covered. It's paid lobbying. So if part of your business is you're a paid lobbyist in local government, that's what's covered. Also, please don't engage in prohibited representation. And prohibited representation primarily is going to be you can't represent or appear in state agencies while you're a member. Representing meaning actual, there are 3 aspects to it. Actual physical attendance on behalf of a client in a state agency proceeding. That's any state agency proceeding. There's one notable exception, which I will note in a moment. It also includes the writing of letters or filing documents on behalf of a client with a state agency. And it includes personal communications made with officers or employees of a state agency on behalf of a client. That means even as a lawyer, but not exclusively as a lawyer, but even as a lawyer, you as a member cannot represent someone else in front of any agency while you're a member, with the only exception being you can appear in judicial tribunals. So as lawyers, you can be in court on behalf of a client in state court, but that's the only exception. Otherwise, there's no representation in any state agency while you're a member.
As long as there's
Oh, wow.
no compensation. As long as there's no compensation. You're saying client. You can do this for.
That's a questionable line. If you're doing it for a client for a constituent. I think.
Communication made. How am I supposed to do that?
Right. Well, this is more formalized. You're representing someone. A classic example, not the only example, but a classic example is so licensing. Let's say you represent someone who is has some disputes about their licensing in front of some state agency, and you're, as part of your business, you represent them, and that's prohibited. If you as a member, you want to call a state agency on behalf of a client, that's not what's covered by this prescription. Constituents, right.
So compensation is different.
So
They're not getting paid.
Well, start getting into those levels of detail, then it's going to start depending, because then it's going to be a question of what's going on there, why are you, if it's not a constituent, but it's a client, but they're not paying you, but you're just doing it. That's for sure. It's a good question that we should discuss. Yeah.
So I
Yes,
know
sir.
there's 5 CPAs in the legislature right now, and as a practicing CPA, and this is a part-time legislature, I file client tax returns to the Department of Revenue. So does that preclude me from continuing on the client, CPA relationship with those clients?
Department of Revenue. The question is can a CPA submit returns on behalf of? It's probably going to be precluded, but it's the direct representation. So you as the CPA filing documents for clients with a state agency likely is going to be covered by this preclusion. But there are other things that we can discuss, things to address that if you want to come see us. Yes? Yes. I believe the question is about what about worker comp courts? Come see us afterwards. There's some specifics. There's like DOA and the JCC, those kinds of things that we may have to talk about a little bit. Generally speaking, though, state agencies, the usual DOR, DOH, DMS, DAX, those types of agencies where there are tend to be a lot of representation, and people do administrative work in front of those agencies, that's what's prohibited. All right. Yes, sir. Well, let me just, if I can just use your question to highlight a more general principle, that is, there's not a prescription. You can represent yourself. Representing yourself is not representation.
There's no problem with me calling the head of that office. She's been going back and forth now for weeks for weeks. So is there a problem for me to personally call? Because I know I met with, I went over.
You're talking about, oh, you're saying call, this is part of your business and you want to call for your business?
My wife, I brought a step back.
Right.
Past 4 weeks, they've been going back and forth to get me resolved. He can't come out, she can't come out, just working police. And the rise, it's about everybody.
Sure. Most likely, because it's your own business, it's not going to be an issue. But I would want to know a little bit more about what those conversations might entail, what you're trying to accomplish, and walk you through it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure.
Last year, I was trying to help us up for 4 years. And because I had ownership in land, and I talked to, I think my department kind of indicated that I had the land long before I became a legislator. So I didn't buy the land.
Right.
Speculated, but it was a public perception that I sold that land in order to products.
Sure.
I was trying to profit.
Would you mind coming to see us afterwards, and we'll talk about it a little bit more? All right. We only have a few more minutes. This has been a great conversation, but we want to get to one of the more important aspects of this presentation, and that has to do with gifts and lobbyist expenditures. If you remember nothing else from today, and I've already touched on it once, please remember this. Please do not accept or solicit that, so don't ask and don't take anything of value from a lobbyist or principal. And you keep that that phrase in mind, anything of value. So it's not just tangible property, it's not just the tickets. It's anything that has value that is given to you is going to be covered by this prescription. And it's just a general rule. If you follow it, you should be all right. Don't accept anything of value from a lobbyist or a principal. The primary concern behind this rule is it's primarily the goodwill spending. There's really call it two types of spending. There's the active lobbying spending. So when a lobbyist prints documents that show the research they've done and they want to present that to you, that's fine. That's part of the lobbying. We're not discouraging people from doing their job as lobbyists or members of the public advocating. The primary concern is the attempt to purchase influence or to purchase goodwill with a legislator, and that's where the when you boil all the rules down to a simple principle, is members are not permitted to take anything of value from a lobbyist or principal. Yes, ma'am.
I want to kick it up a notch. We want to wait for the cookies for a minute.
Sure.
I want to kick it up to turkeys.
Okay.
What happens if we have someone that comes to us and wants to use turkey for our constituents?
Is it a lobbyist or a principal that wants to? Well, the reason I ask is it could be a different answer. So the general principle, the safest approach for you, where you will not get in any trouble, run into any trouble, is abiding by the rule. If it's something of value and it's being given to you by a lobbyist or principal, just don't take it. And where that's going to, and I'll get to the other part about non-lobbyist with respect to your question in a moment. So the question is for anyone that didn't hear, the question is, well, what if someone wants to give you turkeys to then pass on to donate to others? You know, it's a charitable contribution, and you're the pass-through, so to speak. Frozen turkeys. Where this dovetails with another concept is, let's say you're on the board of a charity or charitable organization, and a lobbyist wants to make a contribution to your charitable organization. As a general rule, it's a general matter, that's what we would call a captured charity, in that you're on the board, and it's likely that a lobbyist could not give to that organization as long as you're on that board while you're a member. So I think the same principle is going to apply if a lobbyist comes up to you or a principal comes up to you and wants to give you turkeys to pass on to others as a charitable. That's still going to be risky in the sense that they could be deemed to be trying to gain influence over you or purchase your goodwill through this contribution, so to speak. Now, a non-lobbyist, non-principal person that gives you the turkeys to pass on to someone else, that's not going to qualify as a gift, won't even qualify as a gift, provided you only maintain custody of those turkeys, so long as it's necessary to pass it on to whoever it was intended for. Oh, you used the term turkey. You used turkeys as the example, so I was working with the... All right. Oh, I'm sorry. I do want to highlight. So the one exception to this, even though I've said it's an ironclad rule, don't accept anything of value from a lobbyist or a principal, except you can accept gifts from a relative, from your aunt, from your wife, from some other relative, assuming that they're not doing it to try to gain influence over you. So if it's just a gift because they're a relative and they like you, it doesn't fall within this prescription.
So you're filing your wife's claim?
Probably not. Probably not, actually. Yes. I'm sorry.
So if your relative is a lobbyist, the fact that they're a lobbyist, they're a relative, it's okay.
Right, because, so let me, there's a principle behind this. There is a presumption. The general rule against accepting anything of value from a lobbyist, the presumption is that the lobbyist is doing it to gain goodwill with you. That's the presumption. That presumption is deemed not to apply when your relative is giving you the gift. Now, it's rebuttable, and so it is possible for a relative to be giving you a gift because they do want to influence you. It's just not assumed that way. So under ordinary circumstances, your spouse happens to be a lobbyist, you can take a gift from your spouse.
So if we married a lobbyist, we can file a claim.
Come see me. Okay. I'm going to skip over, just in the interest of time, we're going to skip over, a gift is anything of value given to you by a donee, for which, and I will highlight this principle, it's only a gift if you don't pay consideration for it. So if someone gives you something and you pay them the value for it, it's not a gift because there's been an even exchange. And in fact, with respect to gifts generally, and this gets into reporting requirements, you have 90 days from the time you receive a gift to pay either the full value of that, in which case it's not a gift, or to pay it down to under $100, in which case it's not reportable. So just please remember that concept about gifts, that if there's an exchange, an even exchange of value, it's not a gift. Yes?
So if we go to a luncheon or dinner where we are not charged for a plate, but the sponsor or the organization hosting is not the principal, they do not lobby for us, is that considered a gift that we have to reimburse them for, or is it okay to accept that deal?
There's two parts to that question. So please remember, if they're not a lobbyist or principal, ordinarily speaking, you're not precluded from taking gifts. The question is, though, so you go to some non-lobbyist, non-principal funded dinner that you eat at, you should find out the value, and probably can't find out the individual value, but either find out the specific value to you or what the total cost is prorated across all the invited individuals. If that's the cost. If it's under $100, you don't have to report it. If it's over $100, it's quite the dinner, then you'd have to report it. Yeah. I think it's just from the member's perspective. Yeah. Anything of value. So, travel, tickets, admission fees, memberships, anything of value that's given to you that you don't pay for is a gift. Yes. The reimbursing, I'm sorry. There's not a preclusion against you taking gifts worth more than $100. $100, the number I used before, it's the threshold before you have to report it, and it's a quarterly reporting. But yes, it would still be considered a gift. Yeah, and if the value of those accommodations added up over 3 days to be over $100, you would have to report it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Group, obviously, that's training. Charge everyone else.
Then that sounds like it would be something of value that would probably be prohibited. But I would offer to pay. If you offer to pay what the other folks are paying for that. But if it's from a lobbyist, you said if they lobby, right? Then if they lobby and you're receiving something, if they lobby and you're receiving something of value, it's prohibited. Unless you pay for it, then it's okay. All right. Just gift doesn't include salaries, benefits, and employment type stuff. You work at your office you work at a business, you're on a board. They pass out cookies at the board meeting. It's okay to take the cookies. As long as it's part of your employment and everyone's getting the cookies. All right. There's several things that gifts don't include. They don't include honoraria. They don't include public facilities that are provided as part of a public purpose. Public agencies that transport you somewhere as part of official business, also not considered a gift. It's a great question. It's the next slide. But first, very important, a gift also does not include plaques, awards, those kinds of things for your recognizing your public service. There's little gifts that you get if you're a member of some sort of government official association and they hand out those cool little gifts to members. That's also not a gift. I'm sorry, it was not the next slide, but I'm getting there, I promise. Also, please don't accept a gift from a political committee. That includes your immediate family. Also cannot accept gifts from political committees. Now, honoraria. Honoraria, generally speaking, for anyone who doesn't know, those are fees paid for you to come speak. Also, fees paid for some writing, not a book, but anything else that you intend to publish. That's an honorarium. You can accept honorarium. And you can accept an honorarium. There's not a general preclusion against that. That was the question, I think. But what you can accept are honoraria from any lobbyists, principals, political committees, or legislative vendors.
Those are the only ones who want to pay you.
And you as a member cannot ask for an honorarium from anybody for your services as part of your official duties. Yes, sir.
Can you go back a couple slides for me? Go back. Go back one more. All right. So a gift does not include honorarium event expenses. So the question is, let's say you secured money through an appropriation for Habitat for Humanity. And then at that event, they want to recognize you as Legislator of the Year, and they have a dinner. Is that going to fall under gift?
Do they lobby?
Yes.
Then it would be prohibited.
Okay.
Unless,
so I just wanted that's what
yeah,
I wanted to know, the clarification of.
But it's prohibited because they're giving you a dinner, because they're giving you something of value. It's not the honorarium itself. But if they're a lobbyist, you can't take an honorarium from a lobbyist, period, or from a principal, period. You could pay for the dinner. Always the Trump rule is if you provide consideration, if there's an even trade. Does that
make ethics great again? The Trump rule?
That's right. Does that answer your question, though?
Yeah. Well, when you first showed the slide,
yeah, I
read it as honorary. I didn't know you were talking about honorarium.
Yes, honorarium, fees for speeches. All right. Now, valuation. Just kind of, if you have questions about valuation, please come see us. As a general rule. With respect to a lobbyist, when you're determining how much to pay to make it an even exchange so it's not an expenditure or gift, use fair market value. For gifts and for reporting purposes, it would be the cost to the donor or the customary charge for the services. Now, just real quickly about reporting, your elected state officials. You have an obligation to report, as I'm sure you already know. With respect to gifts, it's every quarter. If you receive a gift in a particular quarter and it is over $100, if any gift over $100, you have to report in that quarter. If you haven't received gifts at that level in a particular quarter, you do not have to report, but it is on a Form 9. It's what's called a Form 9. If you have questions about whether you hit that value or how to value that, please come see us. And then voting conflicts, which I know about an hour ago I promised we were going to get to. Voting conflicts, basically you can't vote on anything that is going to inure to your special benefit, special private benefit, gain or loss. And there's an exception for if it affects a class. There are some factors to be considered. Please come see us if you have a concern about whether it's specific to you or whether it only affects a class. You can vote on matters affecting your salary or expenses. It is really the only time that you as a member can abstain from voting is when there is a voting conflict, provided you do have to file a disclosure within 15 days after the conflict or after the vote, and it either goes filed with the clerk or filed with the AA for that committee, depending on the situation. And we can talk about qualified blind trusts if you need to after, but it could help provide some protection against voting conflicts. You're familiar, presumably, with Form 6 and your obligations to file with the Commission on Ethics every year, a full and public disclosure. This is a constitutional requirement. It's July 1 of every year. This year may be the exception if you've already filed your Form 6 as part of qualifying. That qualifying officer was supposed to transfer that electronically to the Commission on Ethics, but you may want to check. Finally, you're going to have a Florida lawyer or a CPA prepare your disclosures, your Form 6s, and you can use funds from your office account, that excess campaign contribution account that you created under Chapter 106. You can use those funds to pay for the CPA or the attorney. Again, please don't forget to file your Form 9 any quarter where you get $100 or more, a gift of $100 or more. And finally, the key here, as I said at the beginning, is to be aware and to be cautious. Ask those questions. No, you don't have to have the answer to every question. That's our job. What you need to do is just be aware and know to ask the questions, and we are always here. If you have any doubts whatsoever, any questions, and there have been a lot today, all great questions, please come see us. That's why we're here. We will walk it through with you. We will take the amount of time that is necessary to get the facts and to get you comfortable with that situation and come up with a decision. So with that, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure.